The story of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful kings of antiquity, transcends the bounds of historical narrative to become one of the most remarkable testimonies of divine sovereignty in the Bible. Ruling over the vast Babylonian Empire, he is remembered for his greatness, military conquests, and boundless ambition. Yet in the midst of his pride and self-sufficiency, he was directly and profoundly confronted by the God of Israel. Through mysterious dreams, miraculous interventions, and unprecedented humiliation, Nebuchadnezzar was brought to recognize that his earthly power was merely a small part of something far greater, God's sovereign plan. His spiritual journey, marked by highs and lows, serves as a powerful warning against human pride and as proof that even the hardest of hearts can be transformed by divine grace. This account, recorded in the book of Daniel, holds spiritual, theological, and prophetic lessons that continue to resonate to this day. Let's embark on this journey of learning and transformation together. Stay with this video until the end, and leave your name and where you're watching this message from in the comments below. Nebuchadnezzar II was one of the most remarkable rulers of Babylon, leading the empire at the height of its power and glory. His reign, which lasted from 605 to 562 BC, was marked by impressive military conquests, such as the victory over Egypt and the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. He not only expanded the boundaries of his domain, but also solidified Babylon as one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, renowned for its architectural, cultural, and religious contributions. Among his achievements were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the reconstruction of the city of Babylon, adorned with magnificent temples and the famous Ishtar Gate. To Nebuchadnezzar, these accomplishments symbolized not only his political strength, but also the superiority of his gods over those of other peoples. He viewed his conquests as a reflection of the divine favor bestowed upon him by the gods of Babylon, reinforcing his position as the greatest ruler of his era. Despite all the glory associated with his reign, Nebuchadnezzar was also a deeply complex man, filled with pride in his accomplishments and obsessed with control. He believed his authority was unquestionable and that his word was law. However, beneath this facade of invincibility was a leader who at many points was confronted with spiritual realities that challenged his perception of power and divinity. When he invaded Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar took captive the most prominent inhabitants of the city, including young nobles and talented individuals like Daniel and his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To him, these prisoners were trophies of war, living evidence of his supremacy over other kings and proof that his gods were more powerful. The plundering of the temple in Jerusalem, with the removal of sacred artifacts, symbolized not only the defeat of a people, but also of their faith. Nebuchadnezzar's initial encounter with the Jewish captives, however, would mark the beginning of a transformative journey. Unbeknownst to him, the wisdom, faithfulness, and determination of these young men would plant a seed of doubt in his heart. How could men taken from their homeland and living in exile exhibit such unwavering conviction in a God who, seemingly, had not protected them? What could justify their courage and their refusal to compromise their principles, even before the most powerful monarch on earth? This confrontation between the unshakable faith of the Jews and Nebuchadnezzar's earthly power would pave the way for events that would challenge his understanding of authority and divinity. The arrogance that led him to proclaim himself invincible would gradually be questioned, and his trust in the favor of Babylonian gods would be shaken. Though he was still far from recognizing the sovereignty of the God of Israel, this initial contact with the faith of the captives marked the beginning of a journey of learning and humility that would forever transform his view of authority and spirituality. When Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem and conquered the kingdom of Judah, he believed this was definitive proof of the superiority of his Babylonian gods over the God of Israel. In his mind, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile of the Jewish people represented not only a political and military victory, but also a spiritual one. To him, the power of Babylon's gods had prevailed, and the subjugation of the Jews was a direct reflection of that divine supremacy. Among the captives taken to Babylon were young, noble, and promising individuals whom Nebuchadnezzar ordered to be trained in his court. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were among them. These youths, who were given new Babylonian names, as a sign of their forced assimilation, symbolized for the king the integration of Babylonian power over the conquered nations. They were enrolled in a rigorous training program to serve the king, which included learning the Babylonian language and literature, as well as adopting local customs and religion. Although Nebuchadnezzar was fully confident that his victory over Jerusalem was complete, he soon began to notice something unusual about these Jewish youths. Daniel and his companions stood out not only for their intelligence and skill, but also for their steadfastness in maintaining their beliefs and religious practices. When they refused to eat the food offered by the king, which had been dedicated to Babylonian gods, their determination caught his attention. Even at the risk of offending Nebuchadnezzar, they remained faithful to their convictions, requesting permission to eat only vegetables and drink water. The outcome of this decision was unexpected. After 10 days, they appeared healthier and stronger than the other youths who followed the royal diet. For Nebuchadnezzar, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would challenge his notions of power and authority. How could exiled youths, followers of a supposedly defeated god, display such wisdom and strength? The situation escalated when Nebuchadnezzar was troubled by a dream that none of his wise men, magicians, or enchanters could interpret. He demanded not only the interpretation of the dream, but that someone reveal its content without him sharing it. This seemed impossible, and when his advisors failed, he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon, including Daniel and his friends. Daniel, however, requested time from the king, promising to reveal the dream and its interpretation. He and his companions sought God in prayer, and the mystery was revealed to him. When Daniel presented the dream to the king, describing the statue made of different materials and explaining that it represented the kingdoms of the world, including the rise and fall of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. Daniel explained that the dream was a message from the Most High God, who rules over all kings and kingdoms. This event shook Nebuchadnezzar's beliefs. Although he acknowledged Daniel's God as a God of gods and Lord of kings, he still saw him as one among many deities. Nevertheless, this moment marked a turning point. For the first time, Nebuchadnezzar was confronted with the idea that his power was not absolute and that there was a higher force determining the course of history. This initial encounter with the God of Israel planted the first seeds of doubt in his heart, paving the way. Nebuchadnezzar began to have his view of power directly challenged when he faced an extraordinary event involving one of his own decrees. After the dream of the statue and its interpretation, the king, driven by pride and a desire to perpetuate his glory, ordered the construction of a massive golden image to be worshipped by all the peoples under his rule. The statue, erected on the plain of Dura, symbolized not only the unity of his empire, but also the worship of the king's absolute power and his gods. A decree was issued mandating that at the sound of musical instruments, everyone was to bow down before the image and worship it. Anyone who disobeyed would be immediately thrown into a fiery furnace. For Nebuchadnezzar, this command represented the consolidation of his authority. He expected unquestioning submission, demonstrating unconditional loyalty to his rule and to the religion of Babylon. However, three young Jewish captives, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known by their Babylonian names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to comply. They not only rejected the worship of the statue, but also boldly declared their unwavering faith in the God of Israel. When Nebuchadnezzar was informed of their decision, he was furious. To him, such defiance was a direct affront to his authority and his image as the supreme ruler. In his anger, the king ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. The 3 young men were bound and thrown into the flames. The soldiers who carried out the order perished due to the furnace's intense heat. But to Nebuchadnezzar's astonishment, something extraordinary happened. As he looked into the furnace, he saw not 3, but 4 men walking freely in the fire, completely unharmed. The 4th man, he noted, had the appearance of a son of the gods. This vision left Nebuchadnezzar utterly stunned. He rose to his feet and asked his counselors, "Did we not throw 3 men, bound, into the fire?" When they confirmed, he exclaimed that he now saw 4 men walking unbound, unharmed, and that the 4th had a heavenly presence. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the mouth of the furnace and called out to the young men, commanding them to come out. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerged, there was no sign of burns on their bodies, nor even the smell of smoke on their clothes. For Nebuchadnezzar, this was undeniable proof that their God was different from all other gods. He publicly declared that no one in his kingdom was to speak against the God of Israel under penalty of severe punishment, and praised the courage and faith of the young Jewish men. This event marked a second direct confrontation for Nebuchadnezzar with the sovereignty of God. While he had previously acknowledged divine power, he now witnessed a miracle firsthand, something that defied all his beliefs and expectations. Though he still clung to his pride, he began to realize that the God of Israel was not merely one among many gods, but one who wielded power over nature and life itself. This moment further deepened the tension between the king's self-sufficiency and the reality of divine sovereignty, setting the stage for the events that were yet to come. The pinnacle of Nebuchadnezzar's encounter with God came in a surprising and profound way through a dream that deeply unsettled the king and exposed the fragility of his power. He had a vision of an immense tree that reached to the heavens and was visible to the entire earth. Its branches were abundant, providing fruit enough to feed all living beings. Animals found shelter beneath it, and birds made their nests in its branches. However, in the dream, a celestial messenger descended and commanded that the tree be cut down, leaving only the stump bound with iron and bronze chains in the ground. The scene then shifted, focusing on a man who had lost his sanity, living like an animal, eating grass, and being drenched by the dew of heaven. Nebuchadnezzar was deeply troubled by the dream. Unlike other occasions when he relied on his counselors and magicians, this time he sensed that the vision carried a significant and deeply personal meaning. None of Babylon's wise men could interpret the dream, so Daniel, known for the wisdom given to him by his God, was summoned before the king. When Daniel heard the dream, he was alarmed, for he understood that it was a direct warning from God to the monarch. Nebuchadnezzar, noticing his hesitation, encouraged him to speak without fear. Daniel then explained that the tree represented the king himself and his glory. Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful ruler on earth, providing protection and abundance to many. However, his arrogance and self-sufficiency had reached an unsustainable level in God's eyes. The command to cut down the tree symbolized that Nebuchadnezzar would be removed from his position of authority, and his fall would be so great that he would live like an animal, losing his sanity, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is the one who governs the kingdoms of men. Daniel urged the king to abandon his sins, practice righteousness, and show mercy to the oppressed, in the hope that this might delay or even prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar listened to the interpretation, but despite Daniel's clear warning, his pride remained unshaken. He continued to view his position and achievements as a reflection of his own greatness, ignoring the divine warning. 12 months later, while walking on the terraces of his royal palace in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar gazed upon the city and arrogantly declared, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" At that very moment, a voice from heaven spoke, confirming that the sentence pronounced by Daniel had been fulfilled. The kingdom was taken from Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven away from society, living like an animal in the fields, eating grass and being drenched by the dew of heaven. His hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. For 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar lived in this humiliated state until, at the end of the appointed time, he lifted his eyes to heaven and acknowledged God's sovereignty. With that act of humility, his sanity was restored, and he was reinstated to his throne. In an unprecedented act for such a powerful monarch, Nebuchadnezzar publicly declared that the God of Israel was the true sovereign who rules over all kingdoms and whose will cannot be resisted. This experience profoundly transformed the king's heart, as he recognized for the first time that his glory and power were merely reflections of God's grace and not the result of his own strength. After the period of humiliation and restoration, Nebuchadnezzar underwent a transformation that was reflected in his understanding of power, authority, and divinity. Throughout his reign, he had believed that his position as king of Babylon was a demonstration of his personal strength and the superiority of the Babylonian gods. However, the event that led him to live like an animal for 7 years shattered this perception, revealing that his power was temporary and entirely dependent on the permission of the Most High God. When his sanity was restored, Nebuchadnezzar not only regained his throne, but also gained something he had previously lacked: humility. He acknowledged that the God of Israel was not just one God among many, but the sole sovereign over all creation. This revelation marked a turning point in his life, changing not only his perception of divinity, but also his approach to governance. Upon returning to power, Nebuchadnezzar made a public declaration that was unprecedented in his reign. He exalted the Most High God, proclaiming, "His ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." This confession came from a man who had once personified pride and arrogance, but who now understood that all earthly power is granted by God, and that no man, no matter how great, can compare to the glory of the Creator. Furthermore, this transformation was reflected in how Nebuchadnezzar began to view the other nations and peoples under his rule. Previously, he regarded the conquered kingdoms as mere trophies of war and their inhabitants as servants to his glory. After his transformative encounter with God, there seems to have been a greater recognition of human dignity and the importance of justice. While the details of the remainder of his reign are not widely recorded in Scripture, the biblical narrative suggests that his experience shaped a new perspective in his leadership. Nebuchadnezzar's transformation also stands as a testament to God's power to reach even those who seem beyond any spiritual influence. He was the most powerful king of his time, ruling one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, yet he was personally and unmistakably reached by God. This experience demonstrated that no one is beyond the reach of divine grace and sovereignty. Ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar's story left a unique spiritual legacy. Though he began his reign as a symbol of human pride and self-sufficiency, his journey led him to become a living testimony to the supreme authority of God. His public confession and acknowledgement of the God of Israel echoed as both a warning and a message of hope for all nations, showing that even the greatest of kings must submit to the King of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar's final encounter with God was not merely a personal lesson, but also a milestone in biblical history, pointing to the unshakable sovereignty of God over all the kingdoms of the earth. The story of Nebuchadnezzar and his encounter with God is, above all, a lesson about divine sovereignty and the fragility of human power. Despite his status as the most powerful monarch of the ancient world, Nebuchadnezzar had to face the harsh reality that his authority was not absolute and that all earthly power is subject to the will of a greater God. This lesson was made evident in every stage of his spiritual journey, culminating in his public acknowledgement that the God of Israel was the true ruler over all kingdoms. Before his transformative encounter with God, Nebuchadnezzar embodied human pride. He had elevated Babylon to an unprecedented level of glory and prosperity, building monumental achievements such as the Ishtar Gate and the legendary Hanging Gardens. In his mind, these accomplishments were proof of his supremacy and the favor of the Babylonian gods. He believed his empire was unshakable and that his word was the ultimate authority. However, the events narrated in the book of Daniel reveal that God, in his sovereignty, often intervenes in history to demonstrate his authority over the kingdoms of men. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, these interventions began gradually, with enigmatic dreams and the faithfulness of the Jewish captives, and culminated in his public humiliation. God used each of these events to confront the king with an unavoidable truth. Human glory is fleeting and all earthly power is subordinate to divine will. The most defining moment of this journey came when Nebuchadnezzar, after 7 years living like an animal, lifted his eyes to heaven and acknowledged that the Most High God rules over all kingdoms. This simple yet profoundly significant act was a symbol of surrender. By lifting his eyes, he abandoned his self-reliance and recognized that his position and power were gifts, not personal achievements. After his restoration, Nebuchadnezzar made a public declaration that echoed throughout his kingdom. He acknowledged that the God of Israel is just in all his ways and that he humbles those who walk in pride. This confession not only marked the king's personal transformation, but also served as a universal message about the necessity of humility before God. For a man who had begun his journey relying solely on his strength and abilities, this change was a clear demonstration of the impact of divine sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar's spiritual legacy is significant because it shows that God, in his grace, seeks to reach even the most hardened hearts. The Babylonian king, who initially embodied opposition to God, became a living testimony to divine sovereignty. His story is a powerful reminder that no leader, no matter how powerful, is beyond God's reach, and that even the greatest empires are temporary in the face of eternity. Nebuchadnezzar's narrative also highlights God's patience and justice. He did not humble the king immediately, but gave him multiple opportunities to recognize the truth. It was only when Nebuchadnezzar persisted in his pride that God allowed him to experience the fall. Yet, even in his humiliation, there was mercy, as God restored him when he finally acknowledged his sovereignty. This story, recorded in Scripture, remains a warning for leaders and nations throughout the ages. It reminds us that true glory does not lie in human achievements, but in recognizing and honoring the one who rules over all. In the end, Nebuchadnezzar understood this truth and became a witness to the unparalleled sovereignty of God. Although the Old Testament does not explicitly mention Jesus in the story of Nebuchadnezzar, many scholars and theologians suggest that one of the most striking events in the narrative contains a symbolic appearance of Christ. This episode took place during the trial of the fiery furnace, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the flames for refusing to worship the golden statue erected by the king. The vision of the fourth man in the fire, described by Nebuchadnezzar as resembling a son of the gods, is widely interpreted as a divine manifestation that foreshadows the redemptive work of Jesus. In the context of the narrative, the three young men demonstrated unshakable faith in God, declaring that he was powerful enough to deliver them from the furnace, but that even if he did not, they would not bow to the statue. This declaration of faith was a direct affront to Nebuchadnezzar's authority, as he believed himself to be supreme in power and capable of deciding the fate of anyone under his rule. However, when the young men were cast into the fire, the king witnessed something that defied his understanding, a divine intervention that supernaturally preserved their lives. The vision of the fourth man walking in the fire is significant because it highlights God's presence with his people amid tribulations. Although Nebuchadnezzar did not fully comprehend what he was witnessing, he acknowledged that there was something extraordinary about that figure. He described the fourth man as having a celestial appearance, something that transcended his limited perception of power and divinity. For many Christians, this figure is seen as a pre-incarnation of Christ, symbolizing his protective presence and his ability to walk with his people through the most difficult circumstances. This moment in the furnace not only transformed Nebuchadnezzar's perspective on the God of Israel, but also served as a powerful message about divine faithfulness. Despite his initial pride, the king was compelled to recognize that the God of the three young men was different from all the other gods he knew. This God not only demanded faithfulness, but also demonstrated power and compassion by protecting those who served him. Moreover, the vision of the fourth man in the fire points to the future work of Christ, which would be manifested in his incarnation. Just as God was present with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, Jesus promised to be with his people in the midst of adversity. This connection between the Old and New Testaments reinforces the message that God is faithful and present across all generations, walking alongside his children in their moments of greatest need. For Nebuchadnezzar, this event was a crucial step in his journey toward understanding the God of Israel. Although he did not yet have a complete view of who the God he witnessed in the furnace truly was, he recognized that this was a God who responded with power and glory. This experience led him to declare that no other God could save as this one did. Even so, his spiritual transformation was still in progress, and this moment served as preparation for the future events that would culminate in his full acknowledgement of divine sovereignty. The narrative of the fourth man in the fire remains one of the most profound passages in Scripture, not only because of its impact on Nebuchadnezzar's life, but also because of its broader spiritual significance. It reminds us that God never abandons his people, even in the most extreme circumstances, and that his presence is a source of comfort and protection. For Nebuchadnezzar, this event was another step in dismantling his perception of power and authority, leading him to a deeper understanding of the true God. Nebuchadnezzar's story culminates in one of the most profound and universal testimonies of God's sovereignty, reflecting how a divine encounter can transform the human heart. After experiencing the humiliation of being removed from his throne, losing his sanity and living like an animal, Nebuchadnezzar finally acknowledged that his authority, glory, and power were not the result of his own strength, but gifts granted by the Most High God. This acknowledgement marked the conclusion of his spiritual journey and was expressed in a public confession that echoed throughout his kingdom. After 7 years living in degrading conditions, something changed in Nebuchadnezzar. The book of Daniel describes that he lifted his eyes to heaven, and at that moment his reason returned to him. This simple act symbolized a profound inner transformation. By lifting his eyes, he ceased looking to himself as the source of his power and turned his attention to the true sovereign of the universe. It was an act of surrender and humility, marking the end of his resistance to God's call. With his sanity restored, Nebuchadnezzar not only returned to his throne, but also gained a new understanding of his position as king. He declared, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven. All his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." These words were not just a personal confession, but also a universal lesson. The man who had once embodied pride and self-sufficiency now recognized that all power belongs to God and that divine justice is perfect. Nebuchadnezzar's public declaration was unique in nature. For a king accustomed to exalting himself and the Babylonian gods, admitting that the God of Israel was the sole sovereign represented a radical transformation. He not only acknowledged God's authority over his life, but also proclaimed this truth to all the peoples under his dominion. This confession served as a powerful message that no king, no matter how glorious, is above God's control. Furthermore, Nebuchadnezzar's restoration demonstrated God's mercy and patience. Though the king had lived in rebellion and pride for much of his life, God did not abandon him. Instead, he used the circumstances to break through his hardened heart and lead him to the truth. This story is not merely about punishment, but about redemption. God did not just humble Nebuchadnezzar, he restored him and gave him a new perspective on his position and purpose. This final transformation of Nebuchadnezzar also illustrates a spiritual truth that applies to all times and places. God is sovereign over kings and kingdoms, and his authority transcends all human barriers. Nebuchadnezzar's story is a testimony that human pride is always temporary and that true greatness lies in recognizing and submitting to the Most High God. The king, who began his journey believing himself to be invincible, ended it by declaring that his life and power were in the hands of a greater God. Nebuchadnezzar's journey reminds us that divine sovereignty is inescapable, but it is also marked by grace and mercy. His restoration was not only an act of justice, but also a demonstration of God's desire to transform hearts, even the hardest ones. At the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar became a living testament to the fact that God not only rules over the kingdoms of men, but also seeks to relate to those who are willing to acknowledge his authority. The story of Nebuchadnezzar not only highlights God's sovereignty over kings and kingdoms, but also delivers prophetic lessons that extend beyond his life and time. His journey, marked by pride, humiliation, and restoration, reflects a broader, spiritual truth. All human kingdoms, no matter how powerful, are temporary and subject to the eternal reign of the Most High God. This theme, which permeates the book of Daniel, points to God's divine plan to establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed, governed by a king who surpasses all earthly authority. The dream of the statue, recorded in Daniel 2, is one of the most iconic and prophetic visions associated with Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The statue, made of different materials, gold, silver, bronze, iron, and a mixture of iron and clay, represented successive human kingdoms, beginning with the Babylonian Empire, symbolized by the head of gold. The fact that Nebuchadnezzar was the head of the statue reflected his prominent place in human history, but also showed that his kingdom was merely the first of many. The dream culminated with a stone cut out without human hands that struck the statue, shattering it and becoming a great mountain that represented God's eternal kingdom. For Nebuchadnezzar, this dream was both an acknowledgement of his momentary glory, and a warning about the fragility of his power. Despite being the most powerful ruler of his time, he needed to understand that his reign had limits and that his authority was temporary. The stone that destroyed the statue symbolized divine intervention in human history and the establishment of a kingdom that would not be conquered or succeeded by another. This element of the dream had implications far beyond Nebuchadnezzar's life, pointing to the future and to God's eternal purpose. Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation and eventual restoration also served as a living lesson of God's supremacy. During the period when the king lost his sanity and lived like an animal, he experienced firsthand the truth revealed in the dream. All human power is under God's control. When he finally acknowledged this sovereignty, God restored him, but not without first making it clear that the purpose of his humiliation was to demonstrate that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whom he will. This narrative also highlights the idea that human kingdoms, despite their apparent strength and stability, are vulnerable to pride and corruption. Babylon, symbolized by the head of gold, was the greatest power of its time, but its decline was inevitable. This cycle of rise and fall, repeated throughout history with other empires, serves as a reminder that only God's kingdom is eternal. Nebuchadnezzar's restoration can be seen as a preview of what happens when individuals and nations recognize divine sovereignty. There is mercy, grace, and an invitation to participate in God's eternal purpose. Moreover, Nebuchadnezzar's experience has eschatological implications, pointing to a time when all earthly kingdoms will ultimately be subjected to Christ's rule. The stone that destroyed the statue is often interpreted as a representation of the Messiah, who will establish an eternal and just kingdom. Thus, the story of the Babylonian king is not merely a narrative of a transformative encounter with God, but also a prophecy pointing to God's redemptive plan in human history. At the end of his life, Nebuchadnezzar left a testimony that transcends his position as king of Babylon. He acknowledged that the God of Israel was the only true sovereign, declaring that his ways are just and that he is able to humble those who walk in pride. His story is not just a narrative of personal transformation, but also a prophetic reminder that God rules over history and that in the end, his kingdom will triumph over all others. Nebuchadnezzar's journey echoes through the generations, pointing to the eternal truth that every knee will bow before the King of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar's journey, from his height as the most powerful monarch of his time to his humiliation and subsequent transformation, is a powerful demonstration of God's sovereignty and grace. Despite his initial pride and belief that his power was unshakable, he came to understand that everything he possessed came from the hands of the Most High God, who rules over the kingdoms of men. His public confession that all his ways are just was not merely a personal acknowledgement, but a milestone in biblical history, pointing to the eternal truth. God is in control of all things, and his kingdom is unshakable. Nebuchadnezzar's story teaches us that no matter how high we rise, it is only in God that we find our true purpose. It also points to a future where all earthly kingdoms will bow before the King of Kings, whose reign is eternal and perfect. The journey of this Babylonian king is, therefore, an invitation for each of us to recognize divine sovereignty in our own lives and to live with humility before the Creator. And after learning such a powerful story, what will you do? Share it with those you love and know who would be touched by this message, and subscribe to the Truths from the Scriptures channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell to receive updates on future videos.